The autumn fog of 1892 hung thick over London like a shroud, and I found myself once again in the familiar comfort of our lodgings at 221B Baker Street, watching Holmes as he bent over his chemical apparatus with the intense concentration of a man possessed. The acrid smell of his latest experiment mingled with the smoke from his pipe, creating an atmosphere that had become as much a part of our domestic routine as Mrs. Hudson's morning tea. It was precisely at 9:30 on that grey October morning when Inspector Lestrade arrived, his usually confident demeanour replaced by an expression of genuine bewilderment that immediately caught Holmes's attention. "Gentlemen," Lestrade began without his customary pleasantries, "I find myself confronted with a most peculiar case, one that defies conventional explanation, and I confess, exceeds the boundaries of my experience." Holmes set down his test tube with deliberate precision and turned to face our visitor, his grey eyes already alight with the familiar spark of intellectual curiosity. "Pray continue, Inspector. The very fact that you acknowledge the limitations of your experience suggests something truly extraordinary." Lestrade removed his hat and settled into the chair Watson had vacated. 3 days ago, Professor Aldrich Whitmore of the Royal Archaeological Society was found dead in the restricted reading room of the Royal Library at Windsor Castle. The circumstances, Mr. Holmes, are most disturbing. Indeed. Death in a library, hardly the setting one would expect for foul play. "That is precisely what makes this case so confounding," Lestrade replied, producing a leather-bound notebook from his coat. "Professor Whitmore was discovered slumped over an ancient botanical manuscript, Herbarium Mysticum, by one Frater Benedictus, dated 1543. The library attendant found him at closing time, apparently having succumbed while studying the text." Watson leaned forward with professional interest. "What was the cause of death?" The coroner's initial examination suggested natural causes, heart failure. Professor Whitmore was, after all, 67 years of age and had been working under considerable academic pressure. However, Lestrade paused dramatically. "Yesterday morning, Dr. Margaret Ashford, a botanical scholar from Cambridge, fell gravely ill after spending several hours with the same manuscript. She remains in critical condition, suffering from what the physicians describe as severe respiratory distress and neurological symptoms." Holmes steepled his fingers beneath his chin, his expression growing increasingly thoughtful. "2 scholars, both afflicted after contact with the same manuscript. Have there been any other incidents?" "That is what brings me to you, Mr. Holmes. This morning I received word that a 3rd scholar, young Timothy Blackwood from Oxford, experienced sudden violent illness yesterday afternoon, again after examining books from the same rare collection. He is currently hospitalized, though his condition appears to be stabilizing." "The Royal Library at Windsor," Holmes mused. "Access to such collections is severely restricted, is it not?" "Absolutely. Only the most distinguished scholars with impeccable credentials are permitted to handle these manuscripts. Professor Whitmore had been studying the medieval botanical texts for his forthcoming book on alchemical traditions. Dr. Ashford was researching early pharmaceutical practices, and young Blackwood was investigating historical references to plant-based remedies for his doctoral thesis." Holmes rose and began his characteristic pacing before the fireplace. 3 scholars, 3 different institutions, yet all drawn to the same collection of botanical manuscripts. "Inspector, I assume you have considered the possibility of poisoning." "The thought had occurred to me, though I confess I cannot fathom how such a thing might be accomplished in so secure an environment. The Royal Library maintains the strictest protocols. Each manuscript is handled with the utmost care, and scholars are required to use gloves and work under supervision." "Supervision, you say? Who oversees these scholarly visits?" "The head librarian, Sir Reginald Pembroke, and his assistant, Miss Eleanor Hartwell. Both have impeccable reputations. Sir Reginald has served in his position for over 20 years, and Miss Hartwell is considered one of the finest archivists in England." Watson interjected, "Holmes, if we are dealing with some form of poisoning, the method of delivery would be crucial. These manuscripts are centuries old. Surely any poison applied to the pages would have long since deteriorated or been detected." "An excellent observation, Watson. Yet we must consider that not all poisons are subject to the ravages of time. Certain botanical toxins, particularly those derived from specific fungi or plant alkaloids, can remain potent for extended periods under the right conditions. Holmes moved to his bookshelf and withdrew a slim volume on toxicology. Consider, for instance, the alkaloids found in Aconitum napellus, monkshood. In its concentrated form, it can remain lethal for years if properly preserved. The symptoms described, respiratory distress, cardiac irregularities, neurological manifestations, are entirely consistent with aconitine poisoning. Lestrade shifted uncomfortably in his chair. You speak as though you already suspect the method, Mr. Holmes. But how could such a poison be applied to manuscript pages without detection? That, Inspector, is precisely what we must determine. However, I suspect the answer lies not in the obvious application of poison to the pages themselves, but in a more subtle and ingenious method, one that would require intimate knowledge of both chemistry and archival procedures. The detective moved to the window and gazed out at the fog-shrouded street. Tell me, Inspector, have you examined the manuscripts in question? Briefly, though I confess I found nothing unusual beyond their considerable age and scholarly value. The Herbarium Mysticum is apparently one of only 3 known copies in existence, valued at several £1,000s. And the binding? The condition of the pages? The books appear to be in remarkable condition for their age. Sir Reginald takes great pride in the preservation techniques employed by the Royal Library. The manuscripts are stored in climate-controlled conditions and handled according to the most modern archival standards. Holmes turned back to face us, his expression now bearing the focused intensity that invariably preceded his most brilliant deductions. Inspector, I believe we are dealing with a calculated murderer, one who possesses not only extensive knowledge of botanical toxins, but also intimate familiarity with the Royal Library's procedures and the scholarly community that frequents it. Murder, Holmes? Watson asked. Are you certain we're not dealing with some form of accidental contamination? Consider the evidence, my dear Watson. 3 scholars, all studying from the same rare collection, all exhibiting symptoms consistent with botanical poisoning. The probability of accidental contamination affecting multiple individuals in such a specific manner is astronomically small. No, this bears all the hallmarks of deliberate action. Lestrade leaned forward eagerly. Then you'll take the case. Indeed, Inspector, the intellectual challenges presented by this mystery are far too intriguing to resist. Moreover, if we are dealing with a murderer who uses rare manuscripts as instruments of death, we must act swiftly to prevent further casualties. Holmes moved to his desk and began gathering the materials he would need for the investigation. Watson, if you would be so kind as to pack your medical bag, we shall be departing for Windsor within the hour. Inspector, I shall require complete access to the Royal Library, including permission to examine the manuscripts in question and to interview all relevant personnel. That may prove difficult, Mr. Holmes. Sir Reginald is quite protective of his collection, and the authorities at Windsor are understandably concerned about any disruption to the library's operations. Then you must impress upon them the gravity of the situation, Inspector. We are dealing with a killer who strikes through knowledge itself, one who turns the very pursuit of learning into an instrument of death. There can be no greater violation of the scholarly trust. As Lestrade departed to make the necessary arrangements, Holmes continued his preparations with the methodical precision that characterized all his work. Watson observed his friend's intense focus and recognized the signs of a mind already working through the possibilities and permutations of the case. Holmes, Watson ventured, you seem remarkably certain that we're dealing with deliberate murder. Is there some aspect of the case that particularly convinces you? Holmes paused in his packing and fixed Watson with a penetrating stare. Consider this, my dear fellow. 3 scholars, all working independently, all drawn to the same collection of manuscripts. What are the odds that each would be afflicted by the same mysterious illness within days of each other, unless there was some common factor deliberately introduced? But the manuscripts themselves are centuries old. How could a poison be applied without detection? That is the crux of the matter, Watson. Our murderer has devised a method that exploits the very care with which these precious manuscripts are preserved. I suspect we shall find that the poison was not applied to the books themselves, but to something associated with their handling. perhaps the protective materials used to preserve them, or even the specialized tools employed by scholars in their examination. Holmes resumed his packing, his movements swift and purposeful. There is another possibility that we must consider, one that speaks to a motive far more complex than simple murder for gain. What do you mean? These are not random victims, Watson. All three are scholars of considerable reputation, all working in related fields of botanical and pharmaceutical history. It is possible that our murderer is targeting specific individuals for reasons connected to their scholarly work, perhaps to prevent the publication of certain findings or to protect secrets hidden within these ancient texts. The implications of Holmes's theory sent a chill through Watson's veins. If the detective was correct, then they were dealing with a killer whose motives were rooted in the deepest intellectual passions, the pursuit and protection of knowledge itself. Holmes, if you're right about the motive being connected to their scholarly work, then we must consider that other researchers in the same field may be at risk. Precisely, Watson, which is why we must move with all possible speed. Every hour we delay may bring another scholar into mortal danger. As they prepared to depart for Windsor, Holmes's mind was already working through the various elements of the case. The Royal Library represented a closed system, a controlled environment where every variable could be analyzed and every individual's movements traced. If the killer was operating within this restricted circle, then the pool of suspects would be relatively small. Yet Holmes was acutely aware that they were dealing with an adversary of considerable intelligence and specialized knowledge. The choice of botanical poisons suggested someone with advanced understanding of chemistry and toxicology, while the method of delivery indicated intimate familiarity with archival procedures and scholarly protocols. The fog was beginning to lift as their cab made its way through the London streets toward the railway station. Holmes sat in contemplative silence, his sharp features set in concentration as he considered the challenges that lay ahead. Watson, observing his friend's intense focus, felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and apprehension that accompanied their most complex cases. "One more thing troubles me, Watson," Holmes said suddenly as their train pulled away from Paddington Station. "The selection of victims appears to follow a pattern that suggests our murderer is not acting randomly, but is pursuing a specific agenda. Professor Whitmore's expertise lay in alchemical traditions, Dr. Ashford specialized in early pharmaceutical practices, and young Blackwood was researching historical plant-based remedies. All related to the practical applications of botanical knowledge," Watson observed. "Exactly, which suggests that our killer may be attempting to suppress or control access to certain information contained within these ancient texts, information that could prove dangerous or valuable in the wrong hands." As the countryside rolled past their carriage window, Holmes continued to develop his theories about the case. The Royal Library at Windsor represented one of the most secure repositories of ancient knowledge in England, yet someone had managed to turn it into a killing ground with devastating effectiveness. The detective's instincts told him that they were dealing with an adversary whose motives ran deeper than simple murder, someone who was willing to kill to protect secrets that had been hidden in ancient manuscripts for centuries. The question remained, what knowledge was so dangerous that it was worth multiple lives to keep it concealed? By the time their train pulled into Windsor Station, Holmes had formulated a preliminary plan of investigation. They would need to examine not only the physical evidence, the manuscripts, the handling procedures, the storage conditions, but also the human elements, the scholars, the librarians, the administrators, and anyone else who had access to the restricted collection. "Watson," Holmes said as they gathered their belongings, "I have the distinct feeling that we are about to encounter one of the most intellectually challenging adversaries we have ever faced. This killer combines scientific knowledge with cultural access, patience with precision. We must be prepared for a battle of minds as much as a hunt for evidence." The ancient walls of Windsor Castle loomed before them as their cab approached the Royal Library, and Watson could not shake the feeling that they were entering a place where knowledge itself had become a weapon and where the pursuit of truth could prove fatal to those who sought it. The first phase of their investigation was about to begin, and Holmes's anticipation was palpable as they prepared to enter the hallowed halls where scholarship and murder had become inextricably intertwined. The Royal Library at Windsor Castle presented an imposing facade of Gothic grandeur, its ancient stones weathered by centuries of English rain and wind. As Holmes and I approached the entrance, accompanied by Inspector Lestrade, I was struck by the profound sense of history that seemed to emanate from every carved detail of the building's facade. Sir Reginald Pembroke, the head librarian, met us at the threshold, a distinguished gentleman of perhaps 60 years, whose silver beard and penetrating blue eyes spoke of both scholarly authority and gentle refinement. His manner, however, betrayed a barely concealed anxiety that seemed at odds with his otherwise composed bearing. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, his voice carrying the cultivated tones of Cambridge education, "I must confess that I am deeply troubled by these recent events. In my 23 years as head librarian, nothing of this nature has ever occurred within these walls." "I understand your concern, Sir Reginald," Holmes replied with characteristic directness. "However, I must ask that you set aside any reservations you may have about our investigation. Lives may depend upon our ability to examine every aspect of your library's operations." Sir Reginald nodded gravely and led us through corridors lined with ancient oak panelling and illuminated by tall windows that cast long shadows across the polished floors. The very air seemed to whisper of centuries of accumulated knowledge, and I found myself wondering how such a place of learning could have become the scene of such sinister events. "The restricted collection is housed in the Pemberton wing," Sir Reginald explained as we walked. "Access is strictly controlled. Only scholars with the highest credentials are permitted to handle these manuscripts, and they must be accompanied by either myself or my assistant, Miss Hartwell, at all times." We entered a magnificent reading room, dominated by a massive oak table surrounded by leather-bound chairs. Tall shelves lined the walls, reaching up to a vaulted ceiling decorated with intricate heraldic designs. The atmosphere was one of profound scholarly solemnity, broken only by the soft ticking of an ancient clock and the occasional creak of settling timber. "This is where Professor Whitmore was found," Sir Reginald said, indicating a chair at the far end of the table. "He had been working with the Herbarium Mysticum for approximately 3 hours when the tragedy occurred." Holmes approached the chair and began his examination with the methodical precision that characterized all his investigations. He studied the table surface, the chair arms, and the surrounding floor with his magnifying glass, occasionally making notes in his pocket notebook. "Tell me about the manuscript itself," Holmes said without looking up from his examination. "What makes it so valuable?" "The Herbarium Mysticum is one of only 3 known copies of a medieval compendium of botanical knowledge compiled by a Franciscan monk named Frater Benedictus in 1543. It contains detailed descriptions of various medicinal plants, their properties, and their applications in both healing and other purposes." "Other purposes?" Watson interjected. Sir Reginald's expression grew uncomfortable. "The manuscript includes sections on plants that were traditionally associated with darker practices, poisons, hallucinogens, and various substances used in what medieval scholars termed natural philosophy, but which we might now classify as early chemical experimentation." Holmes straightened and fixed Sir Reginald with a penetrating stare. "You mean to say that this manuscript contains detailed instructions for the preparation of poisons?" "Among other things, yes. Frater Benedictus was apparently a scholar of considerable range, and his work reflects the complex interplay between medicine, chemistry, and what might charitably be called the occult sciences that characterized medieval learning." "How many people know about the specific contents of this manuscript?" "Very few. The text is written in medieval Latin with numerous abbreviations and technical terms that require specialized knowledge to interpret. Professor Whitmore was one of perhaps a dozen scholars worldwide who possessed the linguistic and cultural background necessary to fully understand Frater Benedictus's work." Holmes moved to examine the bookshelf where the manuscript was normally stored. "I shall need to examine the book itself, Sir Reginald. Have you handled it since Professor Whitmore's death?" "Only briefly and with the utmost care. Inspector Lestrade requested that I verify its condition after the incident. I found nothing unusual, though I confess I was reluctant to examine it too closely given the circumstances. At that moment, a young woman entered the reading room. A striking figure with intelligent dark eyes and auburn hair arranged in the practical style favored by professional women of the era. She carried herself with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to working in a predominantly male academic environment. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Sir Reginald said. "May I present Miss Eleanor Hartwell, my assistant librarian? Miss Hartwell has been instrumental in maintaining our rare manuscript collection." Miss Hartwell curtsied politely, though her expression remained serious. "I understand you're investigating the terrible events that have befallen our visiting scholars. I must say, the entire situation has left us all deeply shaken." "Miss Hartwell," Holmes said, "you were present during some of Professor Whitmore's research sessions, were you not?" "Yes, I assisted him with several of the more fragile manuscripts. Professor Whitmore was a most careful scholar. He understood the importance of proper handling procedures and followed all our protocols precisely." "Did you observe anything unusual about his behavior or physical condition during his visits?" Miss Hartwell considered the question carefully. "Nothing at all. He appeared to be in excellent health and spirits. His enthusiasm for the work was quite evident. He spoke of making significant discoveries that would revolutionize our understanding of medieval pharmaceutical practices." Holmes exchanged a meaningful glance with Watson. What sort of discoveries? He was particularly excited about certain passages in the Herbarium Mysticum that seemed to describe preparation methods for various botanical compounds. He mentioned finding references to substances that were far more sophisticated than previously believed possible for medieval chemists. Did he discuss these discoveries with anyone else? He did mention that he had corresponded with Dr. Ashford at Cambridge about some of his findings. I believe they were planning to collaborate on a paper about the advanced chemical knowledge demonstrated in medieval manuscripts. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Miss Hartwell, I must ask you to show me exactly how these manuscripts are stored and handled. I need to understand every aspect of the process." Miss Hartwell led us to a climate-controlled storage room where the most precious manuscripts were kept in specially designed cases. The room was maintained at precise temperature and humidity levels, and the manuscripts themselves were wrapped in acid-free tissue paper and stored in custom-fitted boxes. "Each manuscript is handled with cotton gloves," Miss Hartwell explained, demonstrating the proper procedure. "We use special book cradles to support the binding, and scholars are provided with soft brushes to turn the pages without direct contact." Holmes examined the storage containers, the handling equipment, and the environmental controls with intense scrutiny. "These protective materials, where do you obtain them?" "They are specially manufactured by Ashford and Company, a firm that specializes in archival supplies. We have used their products for over 10 years with complete satisfaction." "And the manuscripts themselves, how often are they inspected for condition?" "Sir Reginald and I conduct quarterly assessments of all materials in the restricted collection. We examine each manuscript for signs of deterioration, insect damage, or other problems that might require conservation treatment." Holmes was now examining one of the cotton gloves with his magnifying glass. "These gloves are replaced regularly?" "Yes, we maintain a fresh supply and replace them frequently to prevent any contamination of the manuscripts." "Miss Hartwell," Holmes said suddenly, "I noticed that you have a considerable knowledge of botanical subjects. Are you familiar with the contents of the Herbarium Mysticum?" A slight flush colored Miss Hartwell's cheeks. "I have some background in botanical studies, yes. My university education included coursework in the history of science, and I have found it helpful in my work with the library's scientific manuscripts. Have you read the sections of the Herbarium Mysticum that deal with toxic plants?" "I have examined those portions, yes. They are quite fascinating from a historical perspective, though I must say that some of Frater Benedictus's descriptions are rather disturbing." Holmes continued his examination of the storage room, paying particular attention to the ventilation system and the methods used to maintain the controlled environment. "Sir Reginald, who has access to this storage area?" "Only Miss Hartwell and myself possess keys. The room is also monitored by the castle's security system." "And the visiting scholars, they never enter this room?" "Never. All manuscripts are brought to the reading room for examination. Scholars are never permitted in the storage areas." Holmes made several more notes in his pocketbook, then turned to address the group. I shall need to examine the Herbarium Mysticum itself, as well as any other manuscripts that have been accessed by the affected scholars. I also require a complete list of all individuals who have had any contact with these materials over the past month. Sir Reginald nodded reluctantly. Very well, though I must insist that you observe all proper handling procedures. These manuscripts are irreplaceable. As Miss Hartwell began preparing the Herbarium Mysticum for examination, Holmes drew Watson aside. What do you make of our Miss Hartwell, Watson? She seems quite knowledgeable and professional. Why do you ask? Did you notice her reaction when I asked about the toxic plant sections of the manuscript? There was something in her expression, a flicker of unease that seemed to go beyond mere academic interest. Watson frowned. You surely don't suspect her of involvement in these poisonings. At this stage, I suspect everyone, Watson. However, I must admit that Miss Hartwell's combination of botanical knowledge, access to the manuscripts, and familiarity with handling procedures makes her a person of considerable interest. The Herbarium Mysticum was now laid out on the examination table, and Holmes began his detailed inspection of the ancient text. The manuscript was indeed remarkable, illuminated with beautiful botanical illustrations and filled with dense Latin text that chronicled centuries of accumulated knowledge about plants and their properties. Here, Miss Hartwell said, indicating a particular section, are the passages that so excited Professor Whitmore. This section describes the preparation of various plant-based compounds, including some that are quite toxic. Holmes studied the text carefully, occasionally asking Miss Hartwell to translate particularly difficult passages. The descriptions were indeed sophisticated, detailing extraction methods, purification techniques, and preparation procedures that seemed remarkably advanced for medieval times. This passage, Holmes said, pointing to a section decorated with an intricate illustration of a plant with distinctive leaves, describes the preparation of what appears to be a concentrated alkaloid extract. The symptoms described for its effects are quite specific: respiratory distress, cardiac irregularities, and neurological symptoms. Watson leaned over to examine the passage. The symptoms match exactly what we observed in the victims. Precisely. Which suggests that our killer has used this very manuscript as a guide for preparing the poison. Miss Hartwell appeared visibly shaken by this revelation. You mean to say that someone has actually followed these medieval instructions to create a poison? It would appear so. The question remains, who has the knowledge, access, and motive to do such a thing? Holmes continued his examination of the manuscript, paying particular attention to any signs of recent handling or unusual wear. Sir Reginald, who else has examined this manuscript in recent months? Besides Professor Whitmore, Dr. Ashford, and young Blackwood, there have been only two other scholars, Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann from the University of Heidelberg and Professor James Thornfield from the Royal College of Physicians. I shall need to speak with both of them immediately. Dr. Zimmermann has returned to Germany, but Professor Thornfield is currently in London. I can arrange for him to meet with you. As Holmes completed his examination of the manuscript, Watson noticed that Miss Hartwell had grown increasingly pale and distressed. Miss Hartwell, are you quite well? I am somewhat overwhelmed by the implications of what you have discovered, she replied, her voice trembling slightly. The thought that someone has used our precious manuscripts to commit murder is almost too terrible to contemplate. Holmes looked up from the manuscript with sharp attention. Miss Hartwell, I must ask you a direct question. During your examinations of the Herbarium Mysticum, did you ever attempt to verify any of the preparation methods described in the text? What do you mean? Did you ever attempt to prepare any of the botanical compounds described in the manuscript? Miss Hartwell's face had gone completely white. Mr. Holmes, I must protest. Such a suggestion is completely inappropriate and professionally insulting. I am not making accusations, Miss Hartwell. I am simply trying to understand who might have the knowledge and opportunity to create the poison that has claimed Professor Whitmore's life and endangered others. Sir Reginald stepped forward, his expression stern. Mr. Holmes, I must object to this line of questioning. Miss Hartwell is a respected professional whose integrity is beyond question. Holmes studied both Sir Reginald and Miss Hartwell with the intensity of a hawk observing its prey. Sir Reginald, I appreciate your loyalty to your colleague, But we are dealing with a sophisticated killer who has used advanced knowledge of botanical chemistry to commit murder. The pool of suspects is necessarily limited to those with both the knowledge and the access required to carry out such a scheme. But surely you don't suggest that Miss Hartwell— I suggest nothing at this point. However, I must follow the evidence wherever it leads, regardless of personal sensibilities. As the tension in the room reached an uncomfortable peak, Holmes suddenly straightened and moved to the window. Inspector Lestrade, I believe we have learned all we can from this initial examination. I should like to speak with Professor Thornfield as soon as possible, and I shall also require access to the hospital records of Dr. Ashford and Mr. Blackwood. Of course, Mr. Holmes. I'll make the arrangements immediately. As they prepared to leave the Royal Library, Holmes paused at the door and turned back to address Sir Reginald and Miss Hartwell. I must warn you both that until we have identified and apprehended the killer, this library remains a dangerous place. No one, and I mean absolutely no one, should be permitted to handle any manuscript from the restricted collection without the presence of both of you and appropriate security measures. Do you truly believe the killer might strike again? Sir Reginald asked. I believe, Sir Reginald, that we are dealing with someone who has not yet completed their work. The pattern of victims suggests a specific agenda, and until we understand what that agenda is, we cannot predict who might be next. As they departed the Royal Library, Watson found himself deeply troubled by the complex web of motives and opportunities that the case presented. The killer had demonstrated not only sophisticated knowledge of botanical chemistry, but also intimate familiarity with the library's procedures and the scholarly community that frequented it. Holmes, Watson said as their cab made its way back toward London. I must say that Miss Hartwell's reaction to your questions was quite remarkable. Do you truly suspect her of involvement? Watson, I have learned never to discount any possibility, no matter how unlikely it may seem. Miss Hartwell certainly possesses the knowledge and access required to commit these crimes. However, I am not yet convinced that she possesses the motive. What sort of motive would drive someone to kill scholars who are simply pursuing their research? Holmes gazed out at the passing countryside, his expression thoughtful. That, my dear Watson, is the crucial question. These are not random killings. They are carefully targeted attacks on specific individuals working in related fields. The killer is either attempting to suppress certain knowledge or to eliminate competition for access to that knowledge. But what knowledge could be so dangerous that it would justify murder? Consider the contents of the Herbarium Mysticum, Watson. It contains detailed instructions for the preparation of various toxic compounds, some of which could prove extremely dangerous in the wrong hands. Perhaps our killer is attempting to prevent this information from becoming more widely known. Watson frowned. But surely the knowledge contained in a medieval manuscript could not pose a serious threat in our modern age. Do not underestimate the power of knowledge, Watson. The botanical compounds described in that manuscript could prove devastating if properly prepared and deployed. Moreover, the methods described might provide the foundation for developing even more dangerous substances. As their train pulled into Paddington Station, Holmes's expression had grown increasingly grave. Watson, I fear we are dealing with an adversary whose motives are far more complex than simple murder for personal gain. This killer is operating according to a carefully planned agenda, and until we understand that agenda, we cannot predict where they will strike next. The second phase of their investigation had revealed the sophisticated nature of their adversary's methods, but it had also raised more questions than it had answered. As they made their way back to Baker Street, both men knew that the most dangerous phase of their investigation was yet to come.